Neurons are very simple to understand. It's like an inverted tree. The branches and leaves are dendrites, the trunk is an axon. So just how light is collected by the leaves of the tree, electric signals are collected by the dendrites and sent onwards. On the march, the signals might be helped along by NLMS or DLMS activity. There are these three chemicals called classical monoamine neurotransmitters which have a great role to play in the psychology of organisms. Their activity sends forth a signal, creating a buzz sort of sensation in the brain which we might call pleasure, etc. If you look at the traditional position on happiness, for a long time the scientists used to see happiness, or at least pleasure, as a function of mental dopamine activity. Of late, some of them switched to another theory, saying that happiness was a function of mental serotonin activity. But there is a third of what they call the classical monoamine neurotransmitters, which is norepinephrine or Norepi. Norepi has also been associated with happiness. This seems the most controversial of the three classical monoamine neurotransmitters. For example, some scientists try to label it noradrenaline, claiming that this neurotransmitter is more related to the kidney than to the brain. But ignoring Norepi has set back neuroscience research by many years. Let's see why it's so important. To an extent, Norepi and dopamine are similar, in that both seem to unleash a small parcel of electrical energy to allow the electrical activities in the brain to continue, to allow the organism to carry out thinking. In other words, norepinephrine and dopamine are the two most central chemicals when it comes to infinitesimal psychology. Like an electric eel which unleashes an electrical signal if it detects prey in its vicinity, norepinephrine and dopamine, or shall we say the norepinephrine-linked microsystem or NLMS and the dopamine-linked microsystem or DLMS, are both similar to the extent that both unleash an electrical signal if certain local conditions are met. This operation, the unleashing of energy, affects signals going down the neuron cables, the axons and dendrites. The electrical energy unleashed by dopamine typically adds to and thus boosts the incoming signal so that it multiplies in strength and rushes down the neuron cable with renewed vigor and vitality, whereas the electrical energy unleashed by norepinephrine is released on a highly specific condition. So how does the electrical signaling pattern differ from dopamine to norepinephrine? Dopamine adds energy to boost a signal coming down a particular pathway just because it's coming down that pathway. Only a single signal input to the DLMS is involved. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, adds energy and sends out a boosted signal if and only if there are multiple signal inputs into the NLMS. There is an analog in human engineering. Have you studied the AND gate? It works when there are multiple signals in the multiple input channels. When all the input channels have signals in them, the AND gate sends out a signal from the output channel. Similarly, the NLMS sends out a boosted signal when there are signals in all of its channels. It's exactly analogous to the AND gate. The DLMS, on the other hand, works not like any gate, but it just boosts the signal. That's something which you can call unconditional or monoconditional signaling, and the NLMS carries out conditional or multi-conditional signaling, since multiple signals have to be present in the input for the NLMS to work, as opposed to how, in the dopamine-linked microsystem, it's a simple boosting electrical activity. The requirement is only that a single electrical signal arrive at the input. That is enough to cause the release of the parcel of energy from the output. The other main difference between norepinephrine and dopamine is that norepinephrine is linked to axons, the longer-range cables involved in high-level associative thinking, whereas dopamine is linked to dendrites, the short-range cables involved in a low-level associative thinking. Not just is the electrical operation of norepinephrine relatively complex and critical in higher psychological activities, norepinephrine is also rare, 20 times rarer than dopamine in the average human, and it's even rarer in mental patients or those starved of qualitative nutrition. This is a condition known as norepinephrine deficiency or general psychosomatic disorder of the first type. Say these are 6 neurons. Say they represent some neural tissue. Let's consider the first case when this is Norepinephrine-dominated neural tissue. So say there are 7 small signals coming into this tissue. What happens is that there's an additive effect, and the 4 input signals on the left collapse, resulting in the unleashing of a big signal, and the 3 input signals on the right also collapse, resulting in the unleashing of a big signal. So 7 small signals are coming in and 2 big signals are going out. Let's consider a second case in which this is dopamine-dominated neural tissue. So what happens is that the same number, 7 signals, enter this tissue, and the result is that each of them are boosted, which means that a huge amount of power is being generated in the output of the dopamine-dominated tissue. This must be related to the high noise-to-signal ratio which has been observed in the brains of depressed people. The dopamine-dominated brain multiplies signal volume and is therefore linked to increase of the noise component in the noise-to-logic ratio. The exact opposite can be necessarily said about the Norepi-dominated brain. Norepi is known to be found more in the right brain hemisphere, so you can call a Norepi-based mentality a right brain style of thinking. Oh well, that gives a clue into the apparent campaign against Norepi, why it has not been studied or recognized as much as it should have been. It must be related to what Burgess called the battles of cerebral dominance, in which there was a pro-left brain camp and a pro-right brain camp, and the pro-left brain camp managed to publicly declare some kind of Pyrrhic victory and state that the left brain handles logic, and the right brain is stupid and merely good for art, etc. But the truth is, the Norepi style of working and a healthy right brain is crucial to problem solving. That's why patients of right brain disorder find it difficult to tie their own shoelaces or read a map. If we line up the 3 types of buzzes by the 3 classical monoamine neurotransmitters, norepinephrine is linked to the most important or qualitative form of happiness, which is directly related to the absence of depression. Dopamine pleasure, as they call it, or reward, is not as important. People who use a lot of dopamine in their thought processes end up depressed because there's a lot of signaling, there's too much noise and too little logic in the signaling, and a complete inability of problem solving. Leif Ekblad, the Scandinavian researcher, famously explored the Asperger's diagnosis. Originally, Asperger's syndrome referred to adults with excellent development of nonlinear thinking and articulation, and the absence of dopamine-related social and smooth verbal talents. And similar children, who were called little professors by Hans Asperger, the German doctor who first explored this condition during World War II. Hans Asperger described how some kids would be by themselves all the time and do their own thing, rather than habitually mingle around. That brings us to the opposite of the Aspergian type, the neo-neurotypical, who's more of a dopamine-fueled compulsive linear thinker.
The troop leaders. They hold all the power here. Joining them is every young male's ambition. To be accepted into this elite is the path to privilege, but it's a dangerous journey.
Over the course of 10 years, they had killed so many members from that neighboring community that they had reduced the coalitionary strength of that neighboring group to an extent where our chimps could simply move in and make this big land grab and expand their territory.
An unfamiliar chimp call raises the tension. Not far away, their neighbors are feeding in a fig tree, oblivious to the approaching dangers. The patrol moves off with a sense of purpose. They must remain silent until they close in on their rivals. The attack is on. To intimidate their opponents, the aggressors scream and drum on buttress roots. The battle won, a grisly scene unfolds. An enemy youngster has been caught and killed. The carcass is shared between members of the group and eaten. But exactly why they cannibalize the dead chimp is not fully understood.
How complex these animals are, and really how similar they are to humans.
Dominant males have a highly stressful life as they constantly squabble to protect their position.
They beat him, kicked him. Oh.
They actually attacked one of their own.
Chimpanzees can inflict extreme violence on a member of an outside community, but an attack on an adult member of the same community is so unheard of that anthropologists only had one on record.
Bill and I were following about 8 or so of the males.
Grooming in a path, we were way out to the west.
And we heard someone scream. I briefly was thinking, why were they so upset? What's going on?
And we arrived on the scene.
Most, but not all of the Ngogo chimpanzees were attacking someone. And then I quickly realized they were attacking Grappelli, and that he was in real trouble.
There's no way another animal could survive that.
But of course, even in chimpanzees, you find a lone wolf type personality.
When I heard that Hare was the one chimp who had offered some comfort, some solicitation, some support against the attackers, that didn't surprise me at all.
He's obviously a very interesting chimp in so many different ways. One of the first to tolerate us as humans, have this kinder, gentler side to him, which is quite unusual for a male chimpanzee.
Hare was previously a very social chimp who liked to hang around with these big groups of males. But Hare would just show up, seem to look around, look at the other chimps, but then not stay for very long and go on his way. Nowadays, you'll find Hare in the sort of central part of the Ngogo territories where you find him most often. Now he's got these orphans trailing him around. It's him and these little kids who seem to look up to him. I could probably summarize Hare best by a quote from our longest-term field assistant, Alfred. Hare is the nicest person at Ngogo.
Even in chimpanzees, you'll come across the lone wolf. This shows how everyone has hope.
this is a very old theory. The ancient Egyptians already spoke of men of quality versus men of quantity, and Manetho spoke of a distinction between the gods and men. All this used to be discussed a lot, at least by Ekblad's circle in Scandinavia. He made Ardos, a test which could find how Aspergian you are. That's my result from the Ardos test. Aspi talent is totally different from neurotypical talent. Communication, Aspergian articulation versus neo-NT debate perhaps. Hunting, neo-NTs hunted each other while Aspergians hunted wild animals. Again, while neo-neurotypical perception is about memorizing, for example, in the neat category method, all the names of people met in a party, memorizing as much as you can with the hope that all this data will be useful for some calculations later. Aspergian perception is more about rejecting the data that doesn't fit the worldview and absorbing what does, which is explained as a function of the existing worldview. That, once again, brings us to the topic of nonlinear thinking. So what is nonlinear thinking? Smoke is related to fire. So somehow your brain understands that there's a fire behind the house, although it hasn't seen it. So it connects the dots. It's related to the high-level associative thinking of norepinephrine and axons. Let's contrast it with linear thinking. Linear thinking is about literal verbal syllogic by the dictionary, like to say all men are bad, God is a man, therefore God is bad. If you look at the analytic tradition of academics, apart from ritually citing each other as proof of their statements, they have a habit of making verbal frameworks based on assumption after assumption after assumption. Philosophy of science went for a toss. Like, for example, if you look at economics, there's a Malthusian assumption that man is fundamentally lazy and that there's too much of overpopulation in a bid to justify capitalist parasitism. Then there's the architectural assumption that man needs buildings rather than nature. In every case, at the least these assumptions prove profitable to parasitic linear thinkers at the expense of the rest of humanity. Like pharmacology, which is based on a lot of shaky assumptions, selling crap pills merely to turn over a profit. To understand linear thinking more deeply, let's study a simplified, but not simplistic, model of linear thinking versus nonlinear thinking, a model which unifies psychology, neuroanatomy, and the electrical behavior of the dopamine and norepinephrine-linked microsystems. To start with, we'll study the frontal executive network, or FEN.
Lesson on your neuroanatomy of your brain. It's real simple, but it's really useful. The brain is like two pieces. There's the back of your brain. That's where you create your world. Back here is where you create your world. Space and time, objects, and so forth. That's where it happens back here, okay? And the front is you. It's more you. It's your executive function. That's what it means, executive functions. You're the president of the world, of your world. This is your presidency. This is your country. This is what's controlling everything in your life, including your body, you better have this part of your brain working well. The front is in charge of the whole brain. This is the most important real estate in your life. This is how we organize our flow of our memories. So this part of the brain is extremely important. It is the center of who we are.
The starting point for our study is this diagram. British journalist Rita Carter's account of how, when it comes to problem solving, there were two different areas which Aspergians and normal people or linear thinkers thought with. Since we already know that Aspergians are more like nonlinear thinkers, let's label the red area linear thinking area because it was used by neurotypicals to solve the problem. Let's label the yellow area as nonlinear thinking area because it was used by the Aspergians to solve the same problem. Both these areas are part of the frontal executive network. Note that dendritic arborization means the extent of dendritic branching in a particular neuron. Arborization differs from neuron to neuron. Now, it has been found that the neurons of the frontal executive network have some of the most dendritic arborization of all neurons. It's a relatively obvious theory that I had that the nonlinear thinking area has less dendritic arborization than the linear thinking area. Remarkably, the eyes are very near the nonlinear thinking area, and the eyes probably use a lot of norepinephrine for their focus calculations, so the NLT area is probably heavier on axons and norepinephrine than dendrites and dopamine. Relative to the linear thinking area or LT area. This theory that the NLT area has relatively less dendritic arborization is also supported by the proximity of the NLT area and the orbitofrontal cortex, which is the brain's main center for norepinephrine. And let's recall that norepinephrine is associated with axons as opposed to dendrites. So this suggests that the NLT area is also associated with axons more than dendrites. It's a very strong theory if we say that the NLT area neurons have less dendritic arborization compared to the LT area neurons. We can represent the NLT area and its rear brain backyard as this. Generally, the neuronal tissue has more axons and fewer dendrites. Dendritic arborization is not that much. Similarly, we can represent the LT area and its rear brain backyard as this. The neuronal tissue has more dendrites and fewer axons. Dendritic arborization is quite a lot. This leads to the next theory that there are two types of thinking. The axon and norepi heavy nonlinear thinking and the dendrite and dopamine heavy linear thinking. In linear thinking, when it comes to observation of the stimuli observed, various aspects of the stimuli are clumped together into common storage. So it's more like a sponge which is absorbing a lot of data rather than bothering about the interrelationships between the various aspects of what's being observed. In nonlinear thinking, when it comes to observation, the various aspects of the stimuli are allocated into separate independent storage, so it's not like a sponge which is absorbing a lot of data. In contrast, it's more about determining the interrelationships between the various aspects of the data being observed. The different bits of data get independent storage in a relatively large number of neurons. In the LT area, all the data points are clumped together like a sponge into the quantitative dendritic data buckets. The unhealthy brain memorizes what should not be memorized and misses out important clues and details because of folly or mental fatigue, which is also called brain fog. If you look at Kim Peek, for example, he could memorize many books word for word, but had low IQ and died very young. And if you look at his brain, it had more grey matter. It didn't have a critical white matter tissue which connects the left and right hemispheres. And as you know, grey matter is dendritic and dopaminic, and white matter is more related to axons and norepinephrine, so white matter is more like the nonlinear thinking area. In nonlinear thinking, the burden on the dendrites of each neuron is not so much, and there are a lot of neurons doing a lot of high-level or norepi-style associative calculations, and the stimuli are probably being rearranged, put into context. That's the fundamental basis of what we call big picture or nonlinear thinking. We can get more insight into the kind of associative calculations going on in linear thinking by understanding the most ancient part of the brain called the cerebellum, because the cerebellum is similar to the LT area in how both these parts of the brain have extreme dendritic arborization. The cerebellum controls pretty basic and subconscious linear data processing. Like it helps you not step on your foot while you're walking, and it helps you put the thread into the hole in the needle, and so on. Damage to the cerebellum produces disorders in fine movement, posture, equilibrium, and motor learning. These are examples of linear processing. A large quantity of spatial data, like the current position of your finger, comes into your eyes, and it's used to generate the banal output, like next position of finger. There's no high-level Norepinephrine-style calculations going on. Aristotle didn't even consider the cerebellum as part of the brain. He thought that it was a different organ unrelated to higher thinking. Maybe the Greeks led by Zeus found that the barbarians who died at their gates had larger cerebellums. It's all grey matter. When you see a lot of dendrites in the FEN, like in the large FEN of the Homo floresiensis, well, that's a problem. Linear thinking has run amok, producing a kind of hyper-tribal, Abu-Gogo-like personality who can merely repeat statements and words out of a large, well-categorized library in their heads. Linear thinkers have mental support for libraries or dictionaries, and the design focus is a high quantity of data, a higher speed and quantity of recall and memorization, but no improvement of quality of data. We can say that nonlinear thinkers have mental support for what is called Lakatosian research programs, so the focus is on epistemological quality of data. No animal has such extensive dendritic arborization in the FEN. Of course, this has found use, so quantitative communication is their thing. Linear thinkers can talk a lot, be like walking dictionaries, but the logicality of their content will be pretty low. So the archetypal linear thinker is like your normal employee or your tribal underling or AI-like human. The 48 laws of power, lots of typical examples of linear thinking. Many of these manners are shared with chimps. We can also put out a theory of ugliness right here. The increase in dendritic arborization of the human frontal executive network, the LT area to be specific, is further evidence of the zombification of man. Instead of thinking for themselves, they copy from elites. This domesticated type of man is more willing to obey the whip. He has been domesticated by the master form of zombie. The master form of zombie is also domesticated. He has the same linear thinking as the slave form of zombie. The master form of man is as fruitless and inferior as the slave form of man. Both are two sides of the same coin. The master and slave forms of man are both a problem, so that's where Nietzsche was wrong. And this is the zombie aspect of society. Is the zombie a different species of man? The Homo floresiensis, aka Hobbit, was the archetypal zombie type of character. We can say that because it has a very large LT area, so it must have been an expert linear thinker. Scholars say that it became extinct around 10,000 BC on its home island, but this species has left its mark on mankind.
This obscure disease, found deep within these jungles, holds the key to unlocking vital information for understanding two of the world's most frightening diseases, mad cow disease and its human form, variant CJD.
Quite clearly now the outbreak of variant CJD is very closely entwined with Kuru. And although now we're looking at the tip of the first iceberg in Europe, what we're learning from out here is there's much more to come.
It's a medical detective story that unearths cannibalism. And a world of sorcery. And one that is far from over.
Kuru was a new disease that was killing lots of people and was a complete mystery.
It was in Adelaide in 1957 when Michael Alpers, then a young medical student, first heard about Kuru.
I read about Kuru in the Adelaide Advertiser, and they called it the Laughing Death. But reading into the article a bit more, they indicated this was an important neurological disease. Instead of going to 2 o'clock lectures, I'd go to the library, and I had all these notes that I made, and I had to write down all the literature and little summaries and so forth. So I was really quite obsessed by this.
When Michael was at medical school in the 1950s, Papua New Guinea was an Australian territory, and patrol officers had only recently ventured into its uncharted regions. There, they encountered a totally alien world of Stone Age cultures. Reports started to emerge of a mysterious brain disorder affecting only the Foray people of the Eastern Highlands. Its victims described as trembling, laughing, and falling over.
The first reports about Kuru in the general literature came from anthropologists describing Kuru as a psychosomatic disease. This psychosomatic disease, and they were all dying from it. It didn't seem to make any sense at all.
But what was even more puzzling was that Kuru was only affecting the Foray people, at the time only 20,000 of a total population of 1.7 million on the whole island of New Guinea.
It was confined to this very remote area, but there was this additional fear about Kuru, and in particular about Kuru sorcery.
Sorcerers were feared members of Papua New Guinea society, and sorcery is the local explanation for the cause of Kuru, a belief that remains even today. To try and understand more about sorcery in the Foray, Michael turned to anthropologist Shirley Lindenbaum, working in a nearby village.
People talked about sorcery all the time. Any outsiders who walked through the village were watched in case they picked up little particles of people's food or hair clippings. So sorcery was an obsession.
To the people of Papua New Guinea, sorcery is likened to a form of murder, and justice was commonly sought through revenge killings. These were the second highest cause of death after Kuru amongst the foray.
You gotta beware of the unfounded and lethal zombie type of anger.
Carlton had done every medical test known to science, in particular investigating the prime suspect, cannibalism.
Everybody's been thinking cannibalism, everybody I met, from the before I saw Kuru. But we found that that couldn't be the case. We had no inflammation, all the medical reasons for not, and we threw it out.
Cannibalism had to be dismissed when every one of Carlton's tests on animals demonstrated that Kuru was neither infectious nor transmissible.
We inoculated everything from snakes to bears. And we had watched them for 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 months. 0. This was something new. I didn't know anything about what it was, but it was certainly new.
For the two Kuru researchers, there was still no explanation for the cause of this strange disease and how it was spreading. Kuru remained a complete and utter mystery.
Do they always shake like that?
Yeah.
All the time?
No. It's because I haven't had enough. It'll calm down after this one, I think. It will.
Like when it gets really bad, I get angry, then I twitch.
Stop it. Stop.
Stop.
Scientists have found the strongest evidence yet that the colonists living in Jamestown, Virginia may have resorted to cannibalism.